Thank you very much to Kristin and Gabor and David and Mache for introducing us to this rich collaboration behind this conference, and indeed to Norma, of course, for chairing this session. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me to talk to you this afternoon. It's very nice to be here. But first of all, I want to say how extremely sorry I am not to be with you all in person today in beautiful Budapest, a city which I've visited before and which I really, really love. I would love to have had the chance to meet you all in person and to stroll in those beautiful streets and to eat some of your delicious crispy goose again. And also, just having written a book about the revolutions of 1848, I would have loved to have had the chance to visit the Patufi Literary Museum with you all. So I hope those of you who are there in person are enjoying Budapest hugely. I imagine it must be particularly beautiful in September. The reason I'm not with you in person is that I have to be in the UK this week because I'm trying to get a visa to travel to Europe for a fellowship in Italy. Post-Brexit, this is now a very difficult thing to do, which I find quite heartbreaking. So I'm particularly delighted to have won this European prize because Brexit or no Brexit, I am still a thorough European. And I think the work that the European Society for Political Research is doing in connecting scholars and periodical history together, both within and indeed beyond Europe, is more vital and important now than ever. Anyone who works on the history of periodicals knows how plural, networked and mobile they are, how they've always travelled across national borders, and how fundamental periodicals have always been to admitting underrepresented people into the public sphere, and indeed to breaching boundaries between the centre and the periphery. This is certainly what my work's about, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, but it's also evidenced by the rich connections made manifest, as we've just seen, through the We Changed website. I feel deeply honoured not only to have jointly won the first ESPRit prize, but also to be sharing that prize with the cultural memory activist that is Marianne, whose commitment to restoring women's place in periodical history I have really long admired. I really enjoyed your talk, Marianne. I thought it was brave and fantastic. I found it moving. I think your story is far from unique, as you said. I think we have a serious issue now with early and mid-career academics and non-tenured academics. The pressures are getting unbearable, I agree. I also enjoyed the positive things that you said about the way that you shared spaces on your project, the way that you brought different silos, as it were, together. I thought that was great. And I totally agree that we need to do something about this paradigm of single authorship, which of course is a kind of lie anyway. I mean, I have these so-called monographs here, but in fact, of course, they're massively collaborative. Every academic project is a massive collaboration. I couldn't write these books without a huge constituency of others. And I just really look forward to your future work, as I always do. Your website's a joy, and I shall be returning to it often and indeed using it with my students too. In fact, the Women's Movement 2020 project as well, which I think was a runner-up for this prize, is also inspiring. And I did just want to also mention Thomas Smitz's book, The European Illustrated Press and the Emergence of a Transnational Visual Culture of the News, 1842 to 1870. This book came out just before, literally like more or less a week before I published my latest book on 1848, and I was delighted to see that we have similar things to say about the effects of shared news images across Europe. So congratulations to all of you for all this wonderful work. So in what follows, I'm going to give you a brief idea of the trilogy that I've been working on. Sorry, I should have asked for a slide change. I haven't quite got used to this idea of queuing slides. Could I have another slide? That's it, thank you. So this is the trilogy that I've been working on. The first book, Serial Forms, is of course the winner of this lovely prize. So far, I've published 2 books in this series of 3, Serial Forms, The Unfinished Project of Modernity, 1815 to 1848 in 2020, and then Serial Revolutions, 1848, Writing, Politics, Form, earlier this year. The third and final book is currently under development and is putatively called The Digital Switch, Writing, Race and Resistance, 1848 to 1918. All of the 3 books in this trilogy that I'm working on are about seriality. And I should make it clear that I am primarily a literary scholar. I work in a literature department in London, and my training is in literature and not in media studies or in digital humanities or in the history of journalism. Nevertheless, I've long believed that the material form of texts and their literary forms are intimately related, and that literary scholars have sometimes tended to disregard this and have therefore missed some of the crucial ways in which the literary enters and changes the world, and some of the ways too in which the literary remains porous to the world and changes in response to it too. Periodicals can seem ephemeral to the literary scholars who prefer the secure bindings of books sometimes. But my work aims to show that it was the very mobility, porosity, and seriality of periodicals that remade the 19th century world. Slide, please. It's having an invisible assistant, thank you. In 1825, Walter Scott imagined that, quotes, the labour of composing the Waverley novels might be saved by the use of steam through a mechanical process as that by which weavers of damask alter their patterns so that many new and happy combinations cannot fail to occur. Scott's image is striking as it suggests a machinic proliferation of the serial, almost as if by the 1820s, Scott himself was imagining Scott not as the author of a collection of leather-bound editions, but as a digital programming code capable of generating serial patterns that tessellated, combined, and continued without end. In the first book of my trilogy, Serial Forms, I set out the fundamental premise that underpins all three books, that close attention to serial media forms can reveal a changing understanding of social and political time across the 19th century, and that seriality can help us to think in fresh ways about conventional literary forms. The extraordinary cross-class popularity of Scott in the early 19th century is produced much more than has previously been recognised, I think, by what Umberto Eco has called the generative mechanism of the serial. Indeed, it's probably useful to abandon the idea of the novel in reassessing the influence of Scott's narratives in this period. If we look at them instead as interactive print objects, the phenomenon of Scott and what I call the Scott world can help us to see the innovative serial culture that's emerging in the 1820s. And we can also see that seriality is starting to code information long before computerization, so that the digital age begins much earlier than we tend to think. Slide, please. Thank you. Serial forms goes back to 1815 and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, to a time before mass communication or mass culture, and argues that while the rhythms of seriality in the early 19th century did not create political subjects out of people overnight, they did crucially start to create a feeling of being part of a daily politics for more and more British people. In Serial Forms, I argue that, quotes, seriality is a kind of knowledge that's political, bodily, and historical, a knowledge about being in time. Another slide, please. The second book in the series came out this summer, as I said, Serial Revolutions 1848. Writing Politics Form. So Serial Revolutions maintains that 1848 was a far more important turning point for popular political representation globally than has generally been acknowledged. Without the new consciousness of interconnectedness brought about by a serial permeability of texts, ideas, and politics, the series of revolutions of 1848 would never have happened. And as I said, I'm just starting work on the third and final volume, which is probably going to be called The Digital Switch. And this will examine the ways in which imperial communications technologies created both control at a distance and novel forms of resistance to that control. When they think about seriality, I think most literary scholars probably think first about serialized fiction. But my book set out to enlarge our thinking about seriality by starting to conceptualize it as not just a literary, but also as a political, historical, and social category. So seriality, in my argument, is not only a literary phenomenon, but an emergent mode. Slide, please. In Serial Forms, I write that seriality is about the reformatting of social and political experience. Seriality is a way of understanding the world, and it's fundamental to the emerging biopolitical regime of philanthropic and governmental reform in the 1840s. Seriality is related to, but not identical to, the weaker forms of serialization, and it's about much more than text and print, although text and print are very important to its growing hegemony as a form. Now, form is indeed a word that I've used in both the published books' titles. And I've noticed that several of the reviewers of Serial Forms have remarked that it's not a formalist work as such. And I realise that my version of form, as always already material and already mediated, is far from a conventionally formalist approach. Nevertheless, form remains very important to me. My project was to think about forms themselves as politically and socially active, part of the assemblage, if you like, that operates to transmit information in a meaningful way. I've always seen a live relationship between the aesthetic and the political, so for me, seriality can be both a category of historical and political knowledge and the materialisation of novel possibilities of mediation. In Serial Forms, I knew that I wanted to move away from readings of established classics and to open up the archive to see what other kinds of evidence I could find about daily practices and encounters with print and spectacle. I wanted to go back to a period that often drops out of accounts of the literary 19th century in English, the period between Keats's poems of 1820 and Dickens's Oliver Twist and Pickwick Papers. Deliberately focusing on London, I wanted to write about the bodily experience of the city's rhythms for those people who were too poor fully to participate in a daily news culture because of the heavy news taxes and political censorship, even more brutal, of course, after Peterloo. Slide, please. What did the news mean to the many people who were illiterate or semi-literate, and anyway couldn't afford a daily newspaper and depended on other kinds of cheap printed material? I explored an alternative ecosystem of cheap periodicals, broadsheets, songs, panoramas, dioramas, opera sets, exhibited paintings at the Egyptian Hall, theatrical spectacles, cheap toys, and shows such as the ubiquitous erupting Vesuvius shows. Next slide, please. Thanks. This is a slide that shows the show at the Surrey Zoological Gardens of Vesuvius erupting. I'm also interested in the serialisation of the historical past that's happening in these journals, and I suggest that in this earlier period, historical events are often standing in as placeholders for news. I looked particularly closely at the early miscellanism magazines, with a focus on John Limbird's two-penny weekly, The Mirror of Literature, Amusement and Instruction, which ran from 1822 to 1847, and which Richard Altick characterised as, quotes, the first long-lived cheap periodical in Britain. I looked too at some of the Mirror's imitators, so the Portfolio, the Olio, and the Parterre. All of these early illustrated journals shared very similar formats which I argue in my book are in fact derived from the older formats of the Broadside and the Tract. I'd already worked on another of these early cheap magazines, actually, in my first book, Patent Inventions, Intellectual Property in the Victorian Novel, which came out way back in 2004. In that, I worked on the long-running Mechanics magazine, 1823 to 1873, published by Knight and Lacey, which was a kind of informational compilation targeted at, quotes, intelligent artisans. So these small format demi-octavo cheap magazines of the 1820s were also miscellanies. Brian Maidment writes that magazine size, along with miscellaneity, became their defining characteristics. In Serial Forms, I gathered together all this ephemera to think about the remediation, reserialisation, and the popular reach of, for example, the works of Scott, Byron, and Bulwer Lytton. I show how multiple remediations of literary works made them live, porous, novel, and playable for new constituencies. These material practices of seriality were open-ended and offered new and suggestive ways of inserting oneself into historical time, delivering new forms of knowledge, and I suggest at least some pieces of the apparatus of citizenship. Serial form extends its inquiry into the 1840s, tracing a move from the 1820s miscellanies through to a more programmatic use of seriality and considering the emerging biopolitics of that decade. Slide, please. We mean to run too, and add our share to the heap of increase, announced William and Mary Howitt on launching their radical liberal Howitt's Journal. And run they did, at least until the middle of 1848. I use Howitt's Journal as a serial case study in the book, and I track the representation of children, enslaved people, and the Irish across the whole run of the journal. through its serial repetition of exemplary narratives of injustice around gender, race, class, and age, how its journal unconsciously reveals the profound connections between these constructed categories. And I argue that we need to develop a more complex way of thinking about the developing relationship between kinship, citizenship, and biopolitics at this critical historical moment in the 1840s. So, as a result of all this work on politics, representation, and seriality in the 1820s and 1830s, I realised that I'd sort of accidentally started to write a whole separate book about 1848. I never really intended to do this, but it happened. Because that series of European revolutions just kept calling to me as so important to understanding the 19th century and so underregarded in Anglophone literary studies, although, of course, not in European scholarship. Another slide, please. Thanks. Karl Marx's immediate dismissal of the revolutions in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte created a historiography for 1848 that's persisted for more than 150 years. But serial revolutions suggest that, far from being the failure that Marx claimed them to be, the revolutions of 1848 represent a globally crucial turning point. They were a powerful response to the political failure of governments to care for their people. And importantly, this revolutionary response was the result of new forms of representation and mediation. Until the ragged and the angry could see themselves represented and represented as an international, serial phenomenon, such a political consciousness was impossible. In 1848, Europe became newly conscious of itself. Now, 1848 has long offered a specifically scalar challenge to historians. That spring, more than 50 revolutions broke out across Europe within a period of a few months. They ignited through the citizen towns of France, Austria, Prussia, Italy, and the German states, and eastwards to Hungary, with uprisings in Spain, Ireland, Denmark, and Romania. Historians have often used contagion or circulation to think about the transnational spread of political ideas, but such models obscure historical agency and possibility. Seriality, by contrast, can reorientate our historical understanding and allow us to see things that the traditional historiography has missed. In 1848, the international conversation was not, as we've been told it was, slide please, so it was not about nation, class, or industrial labour. It was about raggedness, the city polis, and constitutional reform. Raggedness, the city polis, and constitutional reform were all being represented in the periodical press in 1848 in new and striking ways. The revolutions of 1848 were multiple, distinct, but linked, and indeed serial. They were even described as serial at the time. But their relative synchronicity made this book rather difficult to organise. It couldn't be organised simply by chronology, nor by cause and effect. I wanted to make a big argument about the importance of seriality to understanding the importance of 1848, but I also wanted to attend carefully to the specificities of each iteration of this extended event. So, how to organise the work? It was really quite a problem. I found the solution, or maybe I did, that's for you to judge, in an approach which owes something to group biography. In this book, this is an 1848 book, more than in the first or the third books, I chose to follow individuals who were travelling in Europe during this tumultuous springtime of the peoples. But I also used print and periodicals to organise the argument. So the first chapter follows British, German and American revolutionary tourists in Paris in the spring of 1848 and shows how they were reliant on second-hand information and contradictory press accounts to make any sense of the incomprehensible events that were happening just outside their hotel windows. I mapped the dynamic debates that were put in motion in 1848. I tracked the new literary forms that were emerging as writers struggled to frame their live responses. And I developed the argument about the agency of serial print, which I inaugurated in the first book. Slide, please. For example, the technologies that made illustrations cheap and fast to produce were only just becoming readily available in 1848, so that the sweep of revolutions was among the first news to offer itself to these modern visual media techniques. Because of the sharing of stereotypes or printing plates, identical illustrations of barricades, insurgent fighting, and newly constituted parliaments and assemblies appeared in illustrated journals in Britain, Germany, France, and beyond. Another slide, please. The ongoing revolution was both serial and serialized. The result was a new visual praxis, which was key to creating a sense of connectivity and identity across Europe. I also used the categories produced by 1848 itself to organise the work: raggedness, constitutional democracy, and the city polis. Perhaps the most important serial category of 1848 was the ragged. The terrible human effects of economic depression were visible in the want and despair on the streets of every city in Europe. And a new media culture was representing this ragged majority, not only to their increasingly frightened rulers, but also to the poor themselves. The city itself became a serial category, each one identically populated by the abject and ragged poor living in subhuman conditions. Slide, please. Eugène Sue's immensely popular newspaper serial Les Mystères de Paris had taken the poorest quarters of Paris as its subject, and G.W.M. Reynolds copied it in his The Mysteries of London. Indeed, Sue's novel spawned more than 100 copies from Berlin to Lisbon, from Melbourne to St. Petersburg. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote her first novel, Mary Barton, not as an, quotes, English industrial novel, as Raymond Williams would later categorise it, but I argue as a very deliberate intervention into this moving series, as part of an ongoing unfinished conversation, which includes Alessandra Manzoni, Fanny Levald, Eugène Sue, Alexandre Dumas, Félix Pyat, one episode, in fact, in a much bigger series that's rolling thunderously across Europe in 1848. The city polis is a vital concept for the chapters in the book on Italy. The American journalist and feminist Margaret Fuller and the British poet Arthur Clough found themselves locked down in Rome under the French and Austrian siege of 1849. Under the pressure of the siege, they both arrived at a provisional serial epistolary form, but by very differently gendered routes. Clough's modern verse epistle on the fall of the 1849 Roman Republic, Amour de Voyage, knowingly echoes Horace's attempt to regenerate the Republic of ancient times in elegant hexameters. Fuller's letters to the New York Tribune newspaper joined a romantic epistolary tradition which allowed, as Mary Favret has shown, quotes, women writers to use the familiar letter for entry into the world of politics. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, watching events in another Italian city, imagines the public sphere as a powerfully physical and embodied space. Her poem, Casa Guidi Windows, inhabits the physical locations in Florence where bodies have been made public. The, quotes, plain flat stone of the pavement of the public street where Dante used to sit, the church of Santa Maria Novella, where the people prayed for deliverance during the plague of 1527, and, slide please, and the Piazza dei Pitti, where Savonarola was burnt at the stake. Casa Guidi Windows derives much of its energy from the collision of bodies within the actual spaces of the city, and from the collision of this actual city against the abstract space of an imagined Renaissance republic, or a virtual republic. The unprecedented growth of print in this decade energised the civic spaces and lecture halls of American and British cities, and I focus on the performances of two famous and very different orators, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Frederick Douglass. Both created a linked chain of public appearances, both bodily and in print, in order to keep themselves constantly in front of the public and to keep their ideas continuously in play. They both travelled and lectured in Europe during this revolutionary period. Douglass from 1845 to 1847, and Emerson from 1847 to 1848. Of course, Douglass travelled to Europe as a fugitive slave and benefited from none of what Laurent Berlin has called the privilege of abstraction enjoyed by Emerson. Serial Revolutions, then, shows how commentators as far apart as Margaret Fuller in Italy and Frederick Douglass in Ireland, where actually Douglass witnessed the start of the potato famine, alongside the revolutions kicking off across Europe. So commentators as far apart as Fuller in Italy and Douglass in Ireland, they all arrived through their experience of 1848 at very similar conclusions about global structures of oppression and the rights of the poor to full human status. The American poet Walt Whitman wrote ecstatically in 1848 that the revolution signalled, quotes, the advent of human rights. And my book concludes that what was really at stake in these revolutions was what it meant to be human. Slide, please. You may remember that I showed you a picture. Sorry, I was supposed to. Okay, I should take that one out because I took that out. Sorry, next slide. I was trying to keep very short. There we go. And oh no, next one. I took out a bit about Douglas because we didn't have time for it. This is the one. Thank you. Sorry about that. I sent it to you too soon, obviously. Okay, you may remember that I showed you a picture of the Jacquard machine at the start of this talk to offer an illustration of Scott's prose. One of the first automated and programmable digital technologies, the Jacquard machine was important to the development of Charles Babbage's difference engine and, of course, to the subsequent emergence of digital computing. The final book in my series, The Digital Switch, is still very much under development, as I said, but I'll be tracing the intertwined literary, political and material histories of the digital, focusing on the crucial move from analogue to digital inaugurated by the electric telegraph after 1848. The digital is imagined in this period, and of course for long afterwards as well, as replacing the material with the immaterial, whilst also, and somewhat contradictorily, challenging ideas of bodily and material cohesion. So coding itself can become a form of violence. Accelerated forms of communication created new regimes of control. Nevertheless, complex patterns of resistance, accommodation, and collaboration continuously unsettled Western imperial authority. The global emerged through local imitation and resistance, and the triumphalist narrative of the West was thereby repeatedly unravelled and rendered incoherent. By the 1880s, a globalized world was becoming visible, but it was also a very decentred and unsettled world. Rethinking the very long history of the digital through the concept of seriality is one part of what my whole trilogy has set out to do. And the theme of this conference, Centre and Periphery, is very germane to this trilogy. The serial displaces the centre and problematises the idea of the periphery. This is echoing something actually that Marianne has also said. Another slide, please. Thanks. In Serial Revolutions 1848, I discussed Pascal Casanova's celebrated book, The World Republic of Letters, in which she applied world systems theory to world literature and argued that its revolutionary history makes Paris seem artistically and politically identified with freedom. But Casanova's paradigmatic model of the production of literature does not involve the messy business of newspaper or periodical printing or the complex politics of distribution and readership. Her freedom is abstract, but freedom has to be imagined and then made on the streets and then accepted. The faith in the the faith in the universality of Paris that she claims makes it the, quotes, denationalized and universal capital of the literary world, betrays an inherently colonial model of literary writing in which every writer tries to gain admittance to the Parisian metropolitan pantheon, to the centre, if you like, by rebelling and making and remaking language. A different model, suggested by the remarkable and linked events of 1848, might be one in which writers are mobilised instead by a sense of the seriality of the social, which is also a sense of the widening horizon of their imagined readerships. Such a serial model gives people the permission and confidence to write their own responses to the contradictions of their own conditions from their own location. These local texts are created as part of a serial, but like all serials, this one cannot be tethered to Paris or anywhere, but is rather always in motion. The seriality puts the part, or the region, into a dynamic and moving relationship with the whole, the nation, the world, even the universe. The mobility of a national-international form means that writers are able to remake the places they write from while joining them up to a transnational serial polity. I'll continue to try and theorise this serial undermining of the centre-periphery model as I work on my third book, and I'll be trying to think there about what seriality can help us with, what it can allow us to do, whether it can produce a more nuanced and complex reading of the politics of colonisation and empire, and indeed the politics of resistance. Okay, slide again, please. I end the second book of the trilogy, Serial Revolutions 1848, with three retrospects on 1848. From England, in Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, from France, in Flaubert's L'Éducation sentimentale, and from Italy, with the images of the Macchiaioli painters in exile from Florence. All of them are looking back to 1848 and asking, how did we get here? And this is the very question that prompted this project, my project, in the first place. Democracy has always been contested, and democracy is under serious bombardment quite literally, as we speak today. I think most of us can probably agree that we find ourselves now in the middle of a perilous and very unsettling time, a dark wood indeed. It's become horribly clear over these last terrible 6 months that we live with and in history, and it's not inevitable that the history of today will necessarily be any less appalling than that of yesterday. It's certainly incumbent upon us all, I think, to keep thinking about how we got here and how we might get to somewhere better. Thank you very much.